I've always wanted to write a strategy guide for a video game, and I'm not sure when this strange urge began to overtake me, but lately it's been getting worse. I've interacted with strategy guides for about as long as I've interacted with video games. When I was 8, sitting cross-legged on the floor playing Tekken 3 with my dad, there was a scarred and tattered manual sitting open on the floor in front of us. In between matches, we would consult the moves list in the hopes that these foreign combinations would eventually be committed to memory. When I was a teen, I would print out cheat codes from online websites and then fold them up and tuck them neatly into the PS2 and PS3 cases that lined our living room shelves. I would then later consult these sheets of paper containing otherworldly knowledge in the interest of causing as much havoc as I possibly could in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. And even now, as ashamed as I am to admit it, I still use guides for some of the video games that I play. They're incredibly helpful in ensuring that you've seen every corner of a video game, but why does it feel so dirty to me? Maybe it's because I feel like someone else is effectively doing the heavy lifting for me. I feel odd admitting that here in this video as if it's some big secret, but I suppose it's in the pursuit of efficiency. I've always wanted to write a guide for a video game, and I suppose the reason comes from pure curiosity. Reading guides online these days can leave you wanting. Sometimes their information is inaccurate or spotty at best. They can miss entire sections of the game or leave certain secrets out, and if you want something accurate that's close to release, well, you can forget about it. But there's something lacking in online modern walkthrough and tip pages. While they represent an accurate funnel at getting the player the information that they crave, how to beat the game, there is a crater-sized void where personality used to be. The bombastic strategy guides and magazines of the 90s cry out for a resurgence in design. And while black text on a white screen is the most effective way at getting information to the player, where's the fun? The strategy guide industry as a whole has affected me, but why? They're just images on paper, and at the end of the day, they're half a reason to capitalize on the success of a video game. But many of you probably have fond memories flipping through strategy guides, either ones you bought and took home with you, or just ones at the store while your parents were doing their shopping. But this industry, while formative and important to many, has been massively underreported on. Why? Who were the people doing the work? Who were the companies behind these guides? Where did they go? This is the goal from the start, to chronicle the rise and fall of video game strategy guides, to see where they began and to see where they ended, but also to take something from that and to write my own guide at the end of this video, learning from their mistakes. And this thought can't seem to stop sticking in my mind, that I can do it better, because it can't be that hard, right? It's cold out here.
Before we can truly dive into the colorful world and history of video game strategy guides, we need to talk about the history of video games themselves. These two stories are intertwined, the strategy guides consistently representing the leech that feeds off the video game market itself. It increases with its peaks and falls with its valleys. Video games technically started appearing in the 1950s with a game called Tennis for Two, which was developed at the Brookhaven National Laboratory in 1958. But even before this, we had the 1950 Birdie the Brain that played tic-tac-toe, Nimrod in 1951. Video games weren't everywhere yet, but experiments were running. Throughout the 60s, many different experiments would be produced on wildly different machines, but it wasn't until the 1970s that arcades, or coin-operated machines, would hit the market. Computer Space and Galaxy Game in 1971, Pong in 1972, and throughout the 70s, arcades would become the gathering point for the video game community. The popularization of the home console console was not quite upon us yet, and spending a few quarters down at the old arcade sure seemed a lot more reasonable than spending $100 on a home console system. That being said, the 70s is the decade in which the home console market started to form its own grips on the world. The Magnavox Odyssey, the first commercial home video game system, was released in 1972, and this console would give people the ability to play games at home without having to go to that old stinky, smelly arcade. Over the next decade, Pong would be released as a home console. The Atari 2600 would shock the market. The Coleco Telestar would succeed at bringing in gamers, and the home console market was beginning to enter its second generation. This is where our story truly begins, the 1980s. Now, there may have been a magazine that had some articles telling people how to do better in certain games. There may have been an underground tip line that was working to help players beat their favorite machines. But as far as I can tell, the man that lays claim to the first officially published strategy guide is Tom Hirschfeld. How to Master the Video Games by Tom Hirschfeld was published in 1981. It's a simple book, only totaling around 170 pages or so. It's quaint and kind of a great representation of how the arcade model colored the view of video games in this era. And a lot of the sentiment in this book is about getting the most bang for your buck, for not wasting your quarters. Hirschfeld opens the book by defending video games as a whole with the line, "Video games are not a fad." Hirschfeld's book contains coverage and strategy on many different games, 30 in total. But before diving into specific games, Hirschfeld gives the reader his 7 steps to mastery, 7 airtight ways to improve your performance at video games. These are reconnaissance, teamwork, concentration, tempo, observation, experimentation, and memorization. Scope out the machine you want to play before actually playing it, get a friend to help you and watch you as you play, concentrate on the game while you're playing it, or as Tom puts it,
when you are learning a difficult video game, you should not be thinking about barbecue-flavored chips.
Learn the cadence of the machine. Everything that happens on the screen is important, so take note. Experiment with the game to achieve the best results. And finally, memorize the patterns that are important to the game that you're playing. These 7 steps to mastery are effectively Hirschfeld giving players the guide, not to the 30 games in this book, but to all games. And some of this information is still even applicable to video games today.
It's easier to become good at a game you enjoy. Entertainment and proficiency are, after all, the 2 basic goals in video gaming.
After this, Hirschfeld provides diagrams for the games that he will be talking about and carries a consistent layout for all of them. He notes the controls, the way the game is scored, the dangers the player will face, a list of observations and strategies for getting better at the game. Some of the strategies seem like they could be useful, and others just seem very obvious. Like when Hirschfeld says of Astro Blaster to learn the sequences of the game to avoid any nasty surprises. This is something that the player will get over time. Learn the game is not a good strategy, just as get better at the game is not a good strategy. But at certain points, he offers more detailed observations, like the fact that if you let your fuel get low during the final section of the sector in Astro Blaster, you can shoot meteors, which will refill your fuel and give you extra points because you are low on fuel. This is information that could only come from playing the game and having some sort of background experience on it. The book's final 2 chapters offer some strange addendums, like the 9th chapter, which sees Hirschfeld giving his off-machine exercise recommendations. Exercises like having a friend test your reaction speed by dropping a pen in front of you and having you catch it, or training your fingers by holding a pen and circling your finger around a doorknob. They're a bit out there. The final chapter is quite telling of the market, though. He ends the book in total defense of home consoles.
Many arcade players tend to look down on home video games. They say the graphics and sound effects are less sophisticated, the games are less challenging, and the technology is less advanced.
Hirschfeld then goes on to provide the advantages of home consoles, and whether this was his opinion at the time or not, or he was just trying to grab both the home console and arcade markets, we'll never know, but at least he called the game right. As I said before, this book is a simple start to our story. It paints a quaint picture of the industry and the market at the time, and the games lack a certain complexity when compared to the AAA modern gaming fare of today, so writing a book dissecting the strategies for 30 of them would be possible. A lot of what Hirschfeld wrote and his general layout will become common in the strategy guides that we will talk about throughout this video. You will see that the market rarely succeeded in developing further than this simple formula of screenshots, controls, scoring, dangers, observations, and strategies. It's the distillation of this same formula that will haunt every strategy guide for decades, like a specter. Hirschfeld wasn't the only one to release a strategy guide in 1981, though. Ken Ustin's Mastering Pac-Man was also important for this time, and instead of taking an eagle-eyes view of all the popular games of its era, it decided to focus on one. Mastering Pac-Man is only around 130 pages or so, and most of those pages are full of charts, but it decides to take a much more detailed look at the game it's covering. It lists and describes the various strategies for approaching Pac-Man games, details the intricacies of the game, and describes the author's methodology on how to become a Pac Master, as he calls it. Hirschfeld and Ustin's approaches to the strategy guide could not be more opposed, though. One takes an eagle-eye view of the video game market, covering many games, and the other takes a detailed look at one game. One reads sort of like a self-help book trying to sell itself to you, and the other takes a cold, logical approach, mostly void of any romanticism outside of its first chapter. Mastering Pac-Man does include a final chapter on how to hustle your way into some Pac-Man games for real money, and what sort of alibis you might be able to use in case you fail in one of these situations.
The glare on this machine's impossible. You can't even see the board. This knob's too loose. There's no way to control the game. My shirt's too tight. The blood can't get to my brain.
While Ustin does manage to have some fun in a few places with the newborn strategy guide format, his approach is mostly devoid of any sort of love for the game that he's talking about. This reflects the general approach to most of the games of this time. The goal is to get the highest score, to get the most bang for your buck. Don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean that people didn't love these games, but these two books set a great precedent for strategy guides moving forward. Most of them fall into two categories. They are either bland technical descriptions of the games that they're talking about, or they have a thinly veiled self-help tone in the background. I'm a master at this game, and I'm going to tell you how to get better. Strategy guides, as you know and love them, would not rear their heads until a few years later, but before we talk about those, I think we need to broaden the definition of strategy guides just a bit. In 1981, the first video game magazine would be released, titled Computer Video Games, or CVG for short. This title could technically be given to Playmeter, a magazine started in 1974, mainly focused on coin-operated machines or arcade games, but Playmeter was more of a trade magazine rather than something resembling the video game magazines you or I know. CVG would start out closer to those trade magazines, featuring a lot of ads, data, and charts, but CVG was set apart by its inclusion of video game news, full video game code printouts, reviews, mailbags, etc. This was still the 80s, so we weren't quite in the era of huge, bombastic front page art and tantalizing ads. Things were a bit more subtle. Sort of. But what does this have to do with strategy guides? Well, game magazines were providing full guides for games as well. It wasn't just random people that were particularly good at arcade games. The video game magazine for quite a long time would be a thoroughly carved avenue for achieving success on games that you were stuck on. In issue 32 of CVG, they introduced a new character by the name of Professor Video. Professor Video would go on to become a regular feature of the magazine, with its own dedicated section providing assistance and player walkthroughs for particularly difficult parts of a game. They had maps that were sent in from viewers and even step-by-step instructions on how to beat a game. This type of advice and assistance wasn't just relegated to the Professor Video section, though. In issue 44 of CVG, an ad for Revs, a 1983 Formula 3 simulation game, had a small guide by David Hunt, a Formula Ford racer, guiding the reader around the Silverstone track. Of course, this is more ad than it is guide, but it illustrates a pretty important point, one that we'll have to grapple with sooner or later, that all guides, in some way, shape, or form, are ads for the games that they're helping you through. CVG also had an adventure helpline section of the magazine, a section in which readers could write in and ask for assistance on particular parts of the games they were struggling with. The column writers would then respond to these letters and give the readers step-by-step instructions on how to beat the section or hints to help them along. So it wasn't just Professor Video in CVG. There were multiple avenues that gamers could take to try to get past areas in a certain game. And you have to keep in mind that in this time period, the decision to write a letter and mail it in, or even buy a magazine, was not one that was made lightly. You would only be taking that action if you were really that stuck or you really needed help. And contrast this to today, when any wiki or guide can be immediately accessed to get the exact information that you need in a brief moment of frustration. But CVG wasn't the only magazine, even in this era, that had a guide section in their publication. Electronic Games had a guide section called Strategy Session that was specifically focused on computer strategy games. They also published guides independently focused on specific games, like their guide for Miner 2049er in the August 1983 issue 18. Computer Gaming World had their own guides as well, with a section called Strategically Speaking, also focused specifically on strategy games, and another one called Scorpion's Tail, focused on adventure games. It's also worth noting that these magazines placed heavy emphasis on aesthetic design. A cover was what was drawing readers in. They had to be eccentric, they had to be loud, they had to say a lot within one large image. Computer Gaming World exemplifies this style, especially in their early issues around 1982. Each image seems to be hand-drawn, and I especially enjoy this kind of crude drawing of Pac-Man eating cake, or Shy Napoleon. There's something so joyful about these images, and it's kind of hard to deal with the fact that these covers would devolve into game art and massive text, begging the readers to buy the last issues in 2006. Obviously, there isn't a lot to distinguish the final covers of Computer Gaming World from anything else that was being sold on the market at that time. But to return to my original point, a lot of magazines around this time had effective methods to deliver the player solutions to their problems. You could write into magazines that you liked or trusted, or you could wait for the specific game that you were having trouble with to be covered. It certainly wasn't the most effective way of delivering or getting the information. The delivery of information was either based on luck that the magazine you read would cover the game you had trouble with, or time, waiting until your letter was answered by the magazine that you wrote into. And maybe you would figure it out before then, but hey, at least someone else could use that solution in the future. It could help get someone else out of a jam. It was a communal help, a way to provide more utility to these publications, another reason to buy, but also a way to help each other, pre-forum and internet eras. Any coverage of video game magazines or guides would be incomplete without first talking about Nintendo Power. Nintendo Power is kind of the ultimate video game magazine guide. The first issue itself is basically just a large guide for multiple different Nintendo games. The first feature and the first 20 pages or so are taken up by telling players exactly how to get past the first 2 levels in Super Mario Bros. 2. It has secret hints, locations, maps of areas, tips for defeating enemies, etc. This is directly followed by a multiple-page guide on the second Legend of Zelda quest, with massive multiple-page maps, followed by a guide on RBI Baseball. These 3 full guides make up almost the full front half of the first issue of Nintendo Power. Nintendo Power also had a counselor's corner that would directly answer players' questions and queries about the games they were having trouble with, not unsimilar to CVG's own Adventure Helpline. Most of Nintendo Power is very similar, and it was obviously meant to be this way. Nintendo had obviously recognized that players were much more likely to buy these magazines that were providing them more utility for the games they were playing, rather than game news or reviews. There was certainly a market for that, a market that other magazines would fill, but Nintendo Power was really about cutting the crap and getting to the meat of things.
Nintendo Power is created by video game experts for video game enthusiasts, with more than 110 pages packed with in-depth tips, tricks, and game reviews on all the best video games you can play on your Nintendo Entertainment System.
But the very first page of Nintendo Power introduces a new type of guide, a far more direct, far more expensive, but extremely efficient form of guide. The tip line. Nintendo had their own tip line called Power Line. You could call this line, which would charge $1.50 per minute, and get your questions answered instantly. This removed the wait time for magazines to print the guide to your game or the answer to your letter. It was perhaps the most efficient form of guide that we had seen yet. But this whole era is basically made up of the primordial soup that strategy guides would arise from. The people that bought and played video games had problems. Video games are meant to be challenging in certain regards, and sometimes the whole point of them is the challenge. But depending on the type of person you are, that challenge might not be for you. And of course, people are going to want to beat or complete the thing that they bought. Books like How to Master the Video Games were meant to make you improve at video games overall, getting better scores to impress your friends, or maybe even just upgrading your skills at this thing that you really enjoyed. Magazines were looking to do the same thing, but to help a broader spectrum of players, specifically their readers. And Power Line was Nintendo focused. While it certainly wasn't the only tip line to exist throughout this era, it was certainly the most popular. These solutions to the problem of I need help on a video game range in effectiveness. They each have their own issues and advantages. If your game is popular enough to have a book written about it, then this is probably the most effective method at getting the help you need. Buying Mastering Pac-Man, or if you lived in Japan, 1985's complete Super Mario Bros. Strategy guide, then your problem was solved, and for a nominal fee. But if your game isn't selling enough for publishing companies to justify creating a book solely around its secrets and hints, then you're gonna have to go the magazine route. Wait for them to publish something that helps you out, or call a tip line. These methods were, again, hit or miss, and searching for a specific magazine could be a problem, especially in the 80s. The most effective method, clearly, was to create a strategy guide specifically for each game. Gaming certainly wasn't big enough yet to justify that kind of money, because, as I said before, the strategy guide market is always attached to the video game market. But the era where this wasn't justified was quickly coming to an end, and would see rise to new, big players on the scene. I toyed with including instruction manuals in my broadened definition of strategy guides. Instruction manuals have come with video games for a very long time, and for most of video game history, when you bought a game, you would get a small or large booklet, depending on the game, that would tell you exactly how to play it. In the 80s or 90s, this was almost essential to have. Certain games would not have intuitive controls or tutorials built into the game. You had to have some way to communicate with the player what buttons did what. Sometimes these manuals were required reading to even interface with the game at all. But sometimes they offered an interesting flavor to the world. They might have extra information on characters. They might have short stories that the game didn't include. They were essential to delivering information, but the aesthetics around that information bolstered the medium to a new height. And it wasn't just about getting information. When I was a kid, sometimes I would read instruction manuals when I couldn't play a video game because it was the next best thing. It was being close to a game when I couldn't actually get my hands on a controller. Maybe my parents were using the TV that day and I wasn't allowed to play video games. I would pull out the instruction manual for Twisted Metal Black and just leaf through it a bit. Maybe I rented a game from a video store and would pull out the instruction manual on the way home so that I could prepare myself for the experience I was about to have. Instruction manuals were a tertiary experience to video games. They came second, certainly, but when you couldn't have first, it would do. This obviously isn't what they were meant for. They were originally conceived to deliver information to the player in the most efficient way possible at the time. But along the way, obviously you're going to have creators and artists that want to spice things up. But an instruction manual is not a strategy guide. An instruction manual is essentially a list of rules for the world you're about to inhabit. It details how the world works. If you were about to be sent off to an alien planet, then the instruction manual would be giving you the basics, the need to know. It would be telling you that the water on this planet is poison and you can't walk through it. It would be telling you that gravity is lowered, so you'll sometimes float in the air when you take a step. It would not tell you the best path to take through the landing zone when you get to the planet. That's a strategy guide. While the instruction manual is a list of rules, the strategy guide are notes from someone who's already been to the planet. This is reflected probably best and most literally in the strategy guide for Earthbound. This book was designed as a travel guide so as to better fit in with its world. In between the notes, descriptions, and strategies listed in the book are in-world menus, newspaper clippings, and lists of steps to take next. Instead of just telling the reader that they can get a bike from a nearby shop, the strategy guide says this.
When you first get to town, go to the bicycle shop that's right next to Hotel Tucson. The manager of the shop is very friendly, and he's generous too. He'll offer to let you use one of his bikes, as long as you don't try to ride double on it. It's faster than walking, so give it a try.
The Earthbound strategy guide attempts to give the player all of the information that they would need on their journey, information that only someone who has already made that trek would have. While an instruction manual is not a strategy guide in a literal sense, the two mediums are extremely similar in aesthetics, design, and appeal. I also would leaf through strategy guides when I couldn't play video games as a kid. It was another next best thing to video games. Sure, at the end of the day, it's about getting information to the player, but I barely remember most of the instruction manuals that I've read in my life, while the grim pages of something like Manhunt or Twisted Metal Black have stuck in my mind for ages now. The two mediums would also fall in similar ways. As physical media starts to disappear year after year, instruction manuals have become completely forgotten at this point. While in the PlayStation 2 era, you might find a manual here or there that would verge on novel length, these days you'll rarely find one outside of collector's editions that goes past a couple pages or so. These pages are usually filled with terms of service listings and legal jargon rather than character profiles. They are a formality, a relic of a bygone era that still only barely exists because companies are kind of forced to still make physical media, and soon they will most likely go by the wayside, just as physical strategy guides currently already have. But the crossover in these mediums provides me ample information for the guide that I will be writing in the final chapter of this video. As I research these topics and learn about them, I must learn from these mistakes. And the aesthetic appeal is something that cannot be understated here. The thing that I loved the most about the strategy guides or instruction manuals that I encountered were their flair. It was the notes in the margins, it was the extra information, it was the images and the way the book was designed. Good art is appealing to both children and adults. The adults have a higher likelihood of knowing why, but for children it's instinctual. It can't just be black text on a white page with screenshots. It's the borders, it's the windows, it's the pictures, it's the theme and the cohesion of all the elements together. These things draw you in. They are important. They stick with you forever, long after the medium that they're a part of is dead and gone. The year is 1990. The Game Boy and NES are the two best-selling consoles on the scene, with Nintendo effectively owning the market. Tetris, Super Mario World, and Dragon Quests are dominating the charts. Gaming revenue is on the climb again, hitting its highest peaks since 1982. In the same year, Russell DeMaria, the senior editor of PC Games magazine, is contracted to write 5 books for a small company called Prima Publishing. These 5 books would be Nintendo Games Secrets, Sega Genesis Games Secrets, TurboGrafx Games Secrets, Game Boy Games Secrets, and the official Lucasfilm Games Air Combat Strategies book. These books were all printed under the Secrets of the Games series label. This is how most of the initial Prima strategy guides would be published, and it would be a while before the Prima label would overtake the Secrets of the Games branding. Nintendo Games Secrets was the first book published under the brand. Written by Russell DeMaria, it shares a lot with Hirschfeld's How to Master the Video Games. The book similarly sells itself to the reader, proclaiming that the book will both show you and tell you what to do in your favorite Nintendo games. The book also contains a smattering of games rather than focusing on one single entry, and it similarly feels a need to defend the medium of video games entirely. Though it does not open as bluntly as Hirschfeld's book, no, video games are not a fad here, but the introduction ends with a statement from DeMaria on video games as violent media.
Video games are often violent in content. That's okay. They're games. Enjoy the games, but please remember what's important. Respect the earth. Respect all life.
DeMaria is often much worse at defending the medium than Hirschfeld was, but he is much more earnest and seemingly genuine in his approach. He even ends the book with a parent's guide to video games that talks about whether video games are addictive or not. His efforts, while well placed, are sometimes laughably bad. He says that while it might seem that your kids are addicted to video games, it's probably just that your kids want to master that video game. And hey, that's what this book is exactly for. If they can use the tips here to master their favorite video game, then they won't be as obsessed anymore. While the intention is true, and I get what DeMaria is saying, suggesting that kids play more video games to cure their apparent addiction, or that they'll eventually forget about the video game, couldn't have gone over well with the parents of 1990. DeMaria's book continues to share a lot with Hirschfeld's when it comes to structure and content. He opens the book with many guides that can apply to not just one game, but all. These small nuggets of advice are split into RPG games and adventure games separately, since new genres had emerged since 1981. For each game, DeMaria lists a brief description, an explanation of what character the player will be controlling, the amount of players, the scoring, how many lives the player has, the controls, and a variety of general descriptions unique to the game. After this is a pretty extensive walkthrough on each game that DeMaria talks about, with step-by-step instructions on how to beat the game from front to back. This book at over 300 pages is about double in length compared to Hirschfeld's first foray into the strategy guide medium. And this shows just how much video games have evolved in the past 9 years. While DeMaria only talks about 20 games compared to Hirschfeld's 30, he takes up double the amount of pages. Mainly because gaming had shifted from a high score focus, something that Hirschfeld had stated was the goal of his first book, to longer form adventures, taking the player on a journey. But it's worth going back to the fact that both Hirschfeld and DeMaria felt the need to defend gaming as a medium. However well done or poorly it was executed, both were accurately representing the sentiments of the time, that video gaming was not yet respected as a medium. In 1971, Hirschfeld was defending them against claims that they were a fad and that they would not last. And 9 years later, when it was clear that video games were not a fad and they were not going away anytime soon, DeMaria felt the need to defend the medium against claims that they were either too violent or too harmful for children to be participating in. Both noble gestures and causes for these authors to fight, and causes that did not need to be fought in these books. The parent's guide at the end of the book is not included anywhere on the outside. It's not advertised on the cover. It was not a selling point or a ploy to get more readers to purchase the book. It was included because DeMaria felt it was important. And this was the beginning of Prima Publishing and their efforts to push into the strategy guide market. Throughout the 90s, they would produce many different guides, continuing their Nintendo Games Secrets series. They would repeat this format with various other systems, like the Sega Genesis Games Secrets, the Nintendo Game Boy's Games Secrets, and the 3D Action Gamer's Bible, which focused solely on games like Heretic, Doom, and Quake. They eventually branched out and started publishing guides on specific games like the Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past Games Secrets. This was the period when Prima started to use their unauthorized, unofficial, and basically independent image as a brand of pride, a marketing image. They used this unauthorized brand to push the idea that they were cool. They weren't working with the big corporations, man. They were the little guys publishing the secrets they don't want you to know about. And it's quite ironic that most Prima titles in the next decade would proudly display the words official or authorized once they actually started to get the licensing rights to the games they were talking about. But while Prima would be finding success with their new formula and would start coming into their own to develop the large focused strategy guides that most picture, their competitor would be rearing their head for the first time. In 1993, Brady Games would publish their first strategy guide, and while investigating and tracing down the roots of the most well-known and popular strategy guide publisher was a difficult task, investigating and tracing down the roots of the second most popular and well-known strategy guide publisher was an even more difficult one. From what I can tell, Brady Games' first book was titled The Mortal Kombat Fighter Companion with a K. I could not find this guide anywhere online. I couldn't even find a copy or a scan of it. All I could find was this blurry, pixelated image from Amazon. They would start out by publishing a lot of guides that seemed to take inspiration from Prima's efforts into the medium. Totally unauthorized Sega Games Guide, Fighting Games Secrets, Black Belt Edition, but also a variety of actually specific and official game guides. The Lion King official game book in 1994, the Toy Story official game book in 1995, and their PlayStation official games book in the same year. Brady Games was completely blurring the lines between being the edgy, cool publisher of secret codes you couldn't get anywhere else, but also publishing official strategy guides for large companies. One thing they did to set themselves apart from Prima, though, was to publish pocketbooks. They were incredibly prevalent in the 90s and would continue to be so during the 2000s. Pocketbooks generally contain cheat codes and would often, not always, cover a variety of different games. They were called pocketbooks, obviously, because they were smaller than the large strategy guides of their day. Brady Games had a massive line of these books that would release annually, like Secret Codes for Handhelds and Consoles 2007, Secret Codes 2004 Volume 1, or Cheat Code Explosion for handhelds and Cheat Code Explosion for consoles. This book in particular is actually reversible, meaning that you can read it one way and get the codes for the handhelds, and flip it over and get the codes for the consoles. It's kind of neat. There was a Star Wars The Force Unleashed Prima official strategy guide that would do the same thing. When read forwards, you would get the PS3 and Xbox 360 version of the guide, and then you would flip it over and get the Wii version. Of the code books, I specifically remember this one, Secret Codes 2006 Volume 2. It's kind of odd because I don't remember having any of the games that are listed in this book. I remember picking this book up at a Scholastic book fair when I was a kid, but it wasn't of much use to me. I really only recognize having Tony Hawk's Underground 1 and 2 from this list, but nothing else. But the point is, this drew me in. It still worked even though there was no utility. The loud cover, secret codes. I was a kid who liked video games, and of course I wanted a book of secret codes just to have. These codebooks were extremely successful for Brady Games, seemingly because they started making them for specific games in the 90s and then continued printing them for somewhere around 15 years. But as far as regular guides go, Brady Games would gain a reputation for mostly underperforming. Their guides were often criticized for lacking context, information, and having poor directions. In fact, one of the worst strategy guides I've ever seen is a Brady Games guide. This is the Final Fantasy IX official strategy guide by Brady Games, written by Dan Burlew. Now, it's not Burlew's fault that this thing stinks. It actually has a pretty cool visual identity to it. I like how clean everything is. The screenshots might be a bit too small for my taste, but it's not bad overall. The problem is with how the guide is formatted. It's around 200 pages or so, and for a decently lengthy turn-based RPG, that's pretty short. The first 50 pages or so are just tables, so how could they condense all of this wealth of information in just 150 pages? Well, that's because it isn't even in the book. In the margins of the pages are little boxes with keywords. These keywords will take you to a website, playonline.com, a website that no longer exists. At least not for this guide. But originally, you would have went to the website, entered a keyword, and gotten access to this information. A special item, a hidden secret, even boss strategies and side quests were hidden behind this system. And the publishers would have put it in there if they weren't trying to shortchange you by printing less pages. It's like the DRM equivalent to strategy guides. No online access? Well, you aren't getting the full thing, buddy. Luckily, some dedicated fans have actually archived the original website, so you can still use it if you'd like to. But even if the website was up and working, this is an incredibly cumbersome way to deliver information to your reader. Having to head to your computer every time you wanted to look up information would waste so much time, and it's kind of the reason you buy the strategy guide in the first place, so that it's all there. I would assume that this was kind of a way for Brady Games to try and get ahead of the internet, which would be their biggest competitor moving forward. Because while Brady Games and Prima were competing for shares of the market, duking it out like two men in a street fight, a silent assassin was approaching, ready to take them both unawares. In 1995, a website called Video Game FAQ Archive was created. Its creator was Jeff Veazey, who intended to collect and archive various video game guides and FAQs from across the internet. Veazey had a problem, that there were two main sources for video game guide information on the internet as he saw it. These were Andy Eddy's FTP Archive and the Fighting Game Archive. But by 1995, both of these websites had become impossible to use because they had gained popularity and traction, and so many people were trying to use them at once. Veazey originally created the site as a place to house a web-formatted archive version of Andy Eddy's FTP Archive. Accessing this information was now simpler and quicker, and it was being done on AOL instead of Netcom. By 1999, Veazey had created message boards for individual games, allowing users to have dedicated spaces to talk about the games that they enjoy. By 2003, the company was bought by tech media company CNET for $2.2 million, along with two other sites. GameFAQs would become most known for its variety of user-submitted content and walkthroughs. At least when I was young, if you needed help on a game, chances are you could look it up on GameFAQs and find hundreds of pages written by community members helping you get through the game that you were stuck on. Even in the beginning of this video, I had stated that I printed out cheat codes for GTA games that I would then fold and tuck into the game cases. Those cheat codes were from GameFAQs. IGN was doing similar things at the time and were even affiliated with GameFAQs before their CNET acquisition. Their first guide was for Super Mario 64, written in 1996. And while the likes of Prima, Brady Games, and others were rising in the market, guides written by internet users were rising just as fast, if not faster. We definitely need to talk about the impending doom that was coming to the physical strategy guide market, but let's first talk about the pros and cons of each of these mediums. Let's start with the physical. While many other companies would be producing guides throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, Prima and Brady Games were the two big hitters, something we've established thus far. Of course, Brady Games was having a lot more success with their pocket books and code books, but what were the two big differences when it came to strategy guides between Prima and Brady Games? The best way to compare these two companies would be to compare the times when the companies actually crossed over, meaning when they covered the exact same game. This didn't happen often. Both companies do have a guide for Final Fantasy XII, Brady Games acquiring the rights to release a guide for the game in 2006 when it released, and Prima Games having their own guide for the Zodiac Age. The Zodiac Age was an updated version of Final Fantasy XII that was released in 2017. It had the Japanese version of the job system that was released a year after the initial launch of the game, along with some other quality of life improvements. It doesn't really feel right to compare these two guides, especially since they were written a decade apart in wildly different gaming spaces, and Prima had the advantage of 10 years of experience on Brady Games' version. The Prima guide was also released after Brady Games, and Prima had already merged in 2015, so it doesn't feel like an accurate dissection of how these two wrote guides during their heyday. But it is interesting to point out that both of these guides are nearly identical in their page count, with the Prima Games version coming in at 351 pages and the Brady Games version coming in at 349. Prima and Brady also both released guides on Resident Evil 4, with Brady Games releasing their initial guide in 2005 and Prima releasing theirs 2 years later on the Wii version when it released. Comparing these guides, the first thing that's notable is that the Brady Games version is far more visually distinct than the Prima Guides version. The character introduction pages all have this mist at the bottom of the page that evokes the feeling of being in the Resident Evil world, like a shadow is looming over these characters. But the text coloring makes some of this less readable, introducing a problem with delivery information by prioritizing aesthetics. But the Prima guide is hard on the eyes in general. It has these bland white pages with these awful font choices that look cheap and generic. There's nothing visually distinct about this guide at all, it just looks boring and lacks feeling. The issue that Brady Games faces with its text during the introductions is not present across the entire book. Most of it has a genuine style, clean text, and good presentation. It manages to carve a distinct place out for itself, winning this duel in the aesthetics department. Both guides contain basically the same information, a list of characters, enemies, bosses, weapons, items, etc., but the Prima guide generally presents this information better. It provides contexts. In a general sense, the writing is just better. This leads me to a larger point, one I'd like to make, one of opinion. The story we've been telling about strategy guides is about to come to a crashing, screeching halt, meaning things are about to change. We will find that they will change out of necessity, out of the demands of the market, out of efficiency. Some of my favorite things about strategy guides is that they weren't just about getting the information to the player. Sure, if we distill the idea of strategy guides into its purest form, it's text on a white background. It's text and maps that show you where things are, how to beat the game, how to beat the level, how to find the secrets, and the most pure form of this would look something like a notepad file with the most concise descriptions you could possibly muster. Move forward, open door, grab item. That is the most efficient way to get the information to the player. But strategy guides are not the most efficient way of getting the information to the player, and they never have been. Flipping through the pages of a guide, reading text, looking for the item you want to sell, looking for the map you're on, looking for the boss you're about to fight. It's slow. It takes time to read. It takes time to find. But there's an aesthetic value in strategy guides. There's flair, art decisions, and font choices are made to ensure that the guide looks as appealing as it possibly can. The writing is executed in such a way to deliver information to the player, but also ensure that they get something extra. Maybe the guide writers would have access to extra information from the developers that they could put into the book to give it extra value. Maybe they could just turn a bland description of an enemy into an eerie and thrilling thrilling tale. Sure, it takes more time to parse this information, but when things are spiced up, the strategy guide becomes an extension of the game, another piece that fits in this world. The game is no longer on its own, a multimedia project, a collaborative work that's bolstered by the piece that you're reading. So when I say the writing isn't very good in the Brady Games strategy guide for Resident Evil 4, just know that it matters. Take for instance how the Brady Games version of the strategy guide talks about the Regenerator enemy.
Regenerators are experimental monsters encountered in the island stage created using Las Plagas that are capable of instantly regrowing dismembered body parts. A regenerator's arm or head can be blown clean off and the monster grows a new limb immediately. Even a large gaping hole through its torso closes up in a few seconds. The regenerative abilities of the monster come from several plagas attached to its skin, which emit a powerful hormone that regenerates skin tissue. And these same symbiotic parasites are also capable of bending the light spectrum to make the regenerator appear invisible.
It's fine. It delivers the background information necessary to the creature, and in the next paragraph, the writer will give us the best ways to deal with the enemy when we encounter it. But now listen to how the Prima Guides version describes the same monsters.
A sickening marriage of Las Plagas parasites and decaying tissue, regenerators are some of the most terror-inducing monstrosities that Leon faces while exploring Sadler's sinister island. At first, these shambling man-sized horrors seem impossible to kill. Any damage dealt to them is quickly undone by some mysterious means. Whole limbs blown off, a regenerator grows them back seconds later. Lost legs, arms, and even heads soon reappear as the creature relentlessly pursues its quarry.
Not only is the second example just written with a better use of vocabulary, but it also displays exactly the same amount of information with less text. It's more efficient, but evokes a personal skew. A perspective is given to the text, a story is told, an image is crafted. The player sees the monster moving as they are reading the words on the page. They are given a better idea as to what to expect when they play the game, rather than just a description of an enemy. Because of this reason, Prima wins in the writing department. But to give another point to the Brady Games version, it's just far easier to read. Layout is important in strategy guides, because while I did talk about the fact that strategy guides are not the most efficient way to deliver this information, that does not mean that they can't make this information easier to parse for the reader. The Prima guide fills their pages with notes, cautions, and tips when this information could have just as easily been included in the main text of the book. It's just a way to make the guide look more visually appealing, but it actually looks much worse. The Brady Games guide only really includes tables to note how many items are in an area, and their maps are just far easier to read. So which version of these two guides is better? Well, that's actually quite a difficult question to answer. The Brady Games version certainly wins when it comes to aesthetics and readability, but it loses out on content and writing. This is the perfect example, though, of the split that the market was about to take. And in the end, it comes down to personal preference. Which would you prefer? Would you prefer a guide that was worse in quality but had a more visually appealing style, or a guide that isn't as visually appealing but is better written? The market would quickly answer in favor of Prima Games. Not literally Prima Games, because they would go under pretty soon, but in this metaphorical comparison, you get it. The players are here, the stage is set, and we have basically three parties: Prima Games, Brady Games, and GameFAQs. Before we get into the fall of this industry, I'd like to quickly talk about the fact that the heyday of strategy guides didn't just begin with these three parties. Like I said before, GameFAQs wasn't the only place to go to on the internet for guides or walkthroughs in the 90s or early 2000s. IGN had already been at the table and will heavily color the current state of affairs once we get there. But in my opinion, GameFAQs was the central example of internet strategy guides. This is because it's so directly at odds with the strategy guide model that we've talked about so far. Up to this point, strategy guides were something that you paid for. They were something that a company, one or a few writers, maybe with the assistance of some artists and editors, created. It was produced in the official years with the assistance of the developer and the people working on the game. But GameFAQs represents the exact opposite of this style. The guides and walkthroughs are written by the public. They are offered for free on the GameFAQs website. They were generally not produced with help from the company and were independent passion projects created by individuals that loved the games they were talking about. And in the beginning, GameFAQs writers were not paid to write these guides. At a certain point, the bounty program would be introduced and would pay writers to write specific guides, but that wasn't why they got into it. The goal wasn't to get paid, the goal wasn't to get clicks, the goal wasn't to sell more books, it was to cover a game that they loved. This is the reason I focus on GameFAQs instead of something like IGN. Don't worry, I will talk about them later, but it's because for the writers at IGN, there was a monetary incentive, and for GameFAQs writers, there mostly wasn't. And even in the physical medium, it wasn't just Prima and Brady games. There was Versus books, there was Piggyback, there was Double Jump. In fact, Piggyback has one of my favorite strategy guides I've ever read for Metal Gear Solid 4: Guns of the Patriots. The book is beautifully presented with tons of information, and that information is all well formatted for readability and ease of use. Detailed maps with brief and concise markers noting item locations, incredibly helpful strategies and background information. It even contains tables with all of the interactable moments and cutscenes, lists of all the emblems and how to achieve them. The design reflects what feels like the UI from the actual game, giving it a style that once again feels like an extension of the game rather than something stapled on after the fact. And this makes sense for Piggyback. They got their start in 1999 with their first guide for Metal Gear Solid. This guide was developed in collaboration with Konami and even includes a personal message from Hideo Kojima. There are pros and cons to working with the people that made the game. I have a list of essential points that a strategy guide needs to hit for it to be effective and appealing, but the crux of it is this. In a now archived article from ZAM called A Walk Through the Past, interviews with former writers on the making of strategy guides, Suriel Vasquez, the writer of the article, states,
"Guides made the unknowable and intimidating nature of large-scale video games a little more friendly, and part of me misses them."
This is perhaps the most essential, most important point. Guides take an intimidating experience and make it less daunting. Sure, you could make the argument that people shouldn't use guides at all, that for games like the Souls series, the whole point is overcoming the challenge, overcoming the adversity, honing your skills to a point where the adversity seems less daunting because of it, not by buying a $20 book. But the reality is that some people don't have the time for that. Some people just want to experience the thing, and by using assistance, it's the only way they'll ever experience it. So there is value in that. But let's start with the to-do list for guides. Number 1, information. A guide needs to have a comprehensive set of information on a game, such that the reader can open its pages and find what they need to know about the game, how it works, its systems, and how to beat it. There needs to be a trust here, from the reader to the author. The reader or player needs to be able to reliably go to the guide and find the information that they're looking for. If they cannot find the information, or if they find wrong information, they lose trust with the guide and thus the author. The guide then loses status in their head. It goes from being a secret tome of forbidden knowledge to just a collection of pages. The mystique is gone. The veil has been lifted. The strategy guide is no more. This is possibly the most important piece in the list of to-dos for our strategy guide. 2. Aesthetic and layout. This one has to come second, but is almost as important as information. If the information is wrong, the guide is pointless. But if the guide is not appealing to look at and read, then the player will forego it entirely. This comes back to efficiency, and this is what people will want most. The market would prove this in the next part of the history that we'll talk about. Efficiency is king. Players buy a guide to remove the intimidation from their heads, but they also buy a guide to get through the game without having to figure it out for themselves. If you've never used a guide before, then you may have been confused throughout this entire video. Why use a guide at all? Most games, especially in the modern day, are designed so that the player can reasonably figure out how to proceed by themselves. Having every single player stuck for hours on end on a single puzzle is generally not considered good game design, unless intended. Games are meant to be beaten, but the difference between someone that doesn't want to use a strategy guide and someone who does is time. How long do they want to take to figure out the puzzle? A couple minutes to look it up in a book and implement the solution, or 15 minutes figuring it out for themselves? And the same goes for secrets. Hidden objectives could take hours to find. Do you want this process to take hours or half of one? There is more satisfaction in finding those secrets on your own, but people value that satisfaction differently. This brings us back to layout. If the layout is poor and information is not organized in a way that you can easily find it, then the point of the guide is once again lost. You could end up searching for a solution in a poorly organized guide, only to take longer to solve the puzzle than it would have taken you to figure it out yourself. And the way the guide looks is important because it's what makes it last. The information is good. It's what you go to the guide for in the first place. But in today's age, what's the difference between me pulling out the MGS4 piggyback strategy guide and looking up a playthrough on YouTube? When it comes to information, most likely nothing. But when it comes to aesthetics, it's everything. Aesthetics and format are what makes strategy guides last. It's what makes the medium novel to begin with. The physical nature of the object, its look, its design, all lend credence to the appeal in the long run. It's why there are, though not many, strategy guide collectors to this day, and no one collects no commentary long plays. And this is not to discredit YouTube walkthroughs. They will have their day in the sun soon, but they do not have the same aesthetic appeal as a physical book. Number 3, writing. This is mostly referencing the substance and content of the writing, which are incredibly important, but the way that the story is told is important too. Like I said before, the guide should be taking you on a journey. It's an extension of the game, not a separate entity. This is when guides are at their highest form, when the words are chosen well, when the writing is readable, when it isn't chunky and broken, it's smooth. This also feeds back into efficiency. The same amount of words can take the same person different amounts of time to read if they aren't written well, if they aren't put together well. A chunky sentence and a smooth sentence are miles apart when it comes to time. And someone does not want to take the extra time to search for the passage that has the collectible they're looking for when, again, they could just look for it themselves. These things all make what I would call a good guide, but the public, the buying masses, would not agree with me. Already by the time 2005 came around, the public's perception of guides was shifting. Many more people had access to the internet by this time, and finding a guide for the game you were looking for was as easy as searching it up on GameFAQs or any other game-related website. In this forum post on the Cheap Ass Gamer website, user Deadhead272003 asks the question, Prima or Brady? Querying the audience for their preferences between the two big guide production companies. Some people provided their preferences, but even if they had a preference, they generally responded by saying that they found their guides online. Even the OP himself said that he always goes to GameFAQs for his guides. It's clear that by this time, a lot of people realized that they were paying for guides that they did not need to. Why pay $20, $30, or even $40 for a guide at the store when you could just look it up online? And at this time, being a young kid, I guess I agreed as well. Did it make more sense for me to beg my parents to buy me a book for a game that I already had to beg them to buy me, or just to look it up on GameFAQs and print it out myself? This shift was clear, and it was obvious that the internet was going to be a problem for all physical media, not just strategy guides. Prima tried to offset this at first by offering digital versions of their guides online. You'd be able to buy a Prima guide from IGN's direct-to-drive digital retail store. But again, this just comes down to monetary difference. Do I buy this guide online or look it up for free? Also, buying the digital version of the guide kind of removes the convenience of having the physical version at your console. The only way for them to compete with this new delivery method was to ensure and trust that their guides were better quality than the ones that were being written at GameFAQs. And in some cases, I'm sure that they were. Guide writers could be working with game developers and could have extra information that people on the outside just wouldn't have. But again, most people were buying guides for their information, and they would prove shortly, once again, that efficiency is king. This was the beginning of the fall, because over the next decade, Prima would take many efforts to try and curb declining sales due to the public's shift to online content. In 2010, they even started releasing their strategy guides on Steam, and when this was shut down a few years later, access to those strategy guides was revoked. Finally, in 2013, due to declining performance in both companies, Prima was merged with Penguin Group, who was also the owner of Brady Games. Brady Games, as you can imagine, wasn't doing well either, and this merger only lasted until 2019, when Brady Games and Prima, now both under the Prima Games brand, were sold to Asteri Holdings. They closed the print operations for good, but Prima would continue to offer digital guides online. They were then bought again in 2022 by Gamers Group. Looking at this website today is a testament to how this once interesting company that effectively popularized this entire medium that we're talking about now was reduced to producing the same tip guides, tier lists, and clickbait articles that all the other publications have been for years. And seemingly this is not a very successful venture. Most of their articles have around 1 to 3 comments, showing near no engagement on most of their posts. Prima and Brady Games would go down silently. Most would have forgotten about their contributions to the industry by the time they fell. People had far moved on from strategy guides by the time that Prima would actually merge with Brady Games, let alone turn into a gaming news website. Despite this, there are still a few companies that publish physical strategy guides today. They are mainly sold as collector's editions works, and I assume are bought more for their high aesthetic appeal and production value rather than actual use as a guide. Piggyback and Future Press are among these companies. Both make pretty good guides, and Future Press doesn't even usually release their guides when the game is released. This ensures further quality since they don't have to meet the strict deadlines or work on old builds of the game before it's on the market. But what replaced them? Surely the need for guides and solutions still exists today. The current state of guides is comprised of, I would say, 3 things. First, you have GameFAQs, which still fits into a broader category of user-generated guides. GameFAQs is still kind of the king to this day, and I actually use it quite often. It's a great site, a reliable resource, and a lot of its user-generated content is really good. Of course, it is user-generated content, so it can't always be hit or miss. A game that's far less popular could only have 1 guide, and it might never be updated again once the user uploads it. But it's generally a pretty good place to go for guidance. It's also worth noting that GameFAQs started around the same time as all of these other companies, but was far ahead of the curve on what would be popular in the future. And they managed to outlast everyone. In this category, you also have things like Steam guides, forum posts, wikis, etc. The second category I would put forward is video walkthroughs. These could be no commentary long plays on YouTube. These could be Let's Plays. These could be live streams of the game that you're playing, though I don't think that's a particularly good way to get the information that you need. Videos that show you the exact collectible that you need, or even just videos of general tips on the game that you're playing fall into this category as well. The third category is any sort of walkthrough website that provides written guides. This could be IGN or Polygon, but these sites are more writers working for a company rather than a community surrounding a game. These also include websites that post tip articles, which is functionally the modern day extension of the tip article in a video game magazine. All of these categories have their pros and their cons, and they all have something in common. They all favor efficiency. It is far more efficient to find a walkthrough of someone actually playing the game that you're stuck on YouTube, especially if you plan to use the entire guide for your playthrough. Even if you just need collectibles, there are videos of that. If you need specific information, it's far more efficient to just look up the specific quest or a mission walkthrough on a wiki. You'll quickly find the quest, all of its outcomes, etc. Don't want to watch a video? IGN probably has an interactive map that has lists of all of the collectibles and quest locations. And GameFAQs will have a detailed written guide with tons of boss strategies nearly every time. The current state of video game guides is as efficient as it's ever been, especially now that everyone has access to phones. You can just pull the guide up on your phone and play the game on your couch. This process has been streamlined, and this was the true death blow to the physical strategy guides of the past. They just couldn't compete. And they tried, but especially when most of this content is offered for free, monetized purely by ad revenue on the websites or videos, they never stood a chance. But what's the problem? There is absolutely no shortage of information about video games on the internet. As a market and as consumers, we removed the inefficiency in strategy guides. We can now get the data we need in the most effective way possible, but something is always lost in the process. Because at the end of the day, there is a problem. There's a hollow here, a void where something once was. That's design, that's aesthetic, that's soul. It isn't the content that's the problem. That has arguably gotten much better. It's the in-between. Obviously, the physicality of the medium is gone. There's nothing to hold anymore. But there's also nothing to make this new version of the medium last. What's going to make people remember using a specific GameFAQs guide? What distinguishes the black text on a white background to the white text on a black background? It's all effectively the same, and the guides now take on the aesthetic design of the site that they're housed on. GameFAQs looks like GameFAQs, and IGN looks like IGN. And video walkthroughs are a perfect example of this. Pretty early on, strategy guides started using screenshots as an effective way to communicate to the player what they were supposed to do. Screenshots are good. It's another method to reinforce the idea in the reader's mind. Even in How to Master the Video Games, drawn diagrams of the screen were included in the book. Video walkthroughs are the ultimate distillation of a strategy guide. Showing someone literally playing a game is the most effective way of guiding a player through the game, but it's not an extension of the game. It is literally the game itself. And it's not the fault of the people who make the video walkthroughs or the GameFAQs guides. Like I said, there's good work being done, and some of the GameFAQs guides I've read are the most detailed and effective guides I've ever seen. They are incredibly good at what they do, which is giving information to the reader. There's no incentive to create a guide that pops on some sort of separate website, something that's meant to last. This is the current situation. And to people that don't or have never cared about the aesthetic appeal of strategy guides, which probably applies to most of the people on planet Earth today, then the current situation is just much more effective and makes more logical sense. But this situation must be taken into account as I try to create a strategy guide of my own. Before we move on to the final section of this video, it's important that we take one final detour to talk about the absolute infatuation with cheat codes, a trend that's completely lost in gaming at this point. Cheat codes are any sort of code that was programmed into the game and can be executed by the player to change the rules of the game. The first cheat code ever implemented seems to be for the game Manic Miner, released on the ZX Spectrum. The game was released in 1983, and the code was simply 60311769. This code would allow the user to enter a cheat mode that was mostly intended for playtesters of the game, but would make it into the final product. Of course, the Konami code is probably the most famous example of this, and this code was used in many different Konami games throughout the years, but first appeared in 1986's Gradius, even though it was later known as the Contra code. The obsession with cheat codes, in my opinion, would reach its peak during the mid-2000s, when strategy guide publishers like Prima and Brady Games were still finding success with their print runs, and when GameFAQs was starting to gain traction. Cheat codes were a much smaller version of the strategy guide market. We talked about previously how Brady Games had found great success with their cheat code and pocketbook lines. Interestingly enough, Prima also had their own line of cheat code books. It was similarly branded, but included many more cheat codes than the average average Brady Games publication. These books promised an unimaginable wealth of knowledge to the player, the ability to quick start their adventure into this game, and it wasn't always about beating the game, but having the most fun in the shortest time possible. I, mostly like you, used cheat codes in GTA games as a kid. Being able to quickly get a rocket launcher, or a jet, or the coolest, fastest car possible was half the fun. Causing as much chaos and havoc as possible was the goal, and the battleground was police swarming in San Andreas. GameFAQs, as previously noted, was a great place for cheat codes in my early days. Many websites had similar lists of cheat codes, and magazine publications would print lists of them in an effort to entice new readers. But one program that made up an important part of my cheat scouring youth was G4's Cheat. If you aren't aware, G4 was a channel dedicated to gaming content before YouTube and website publications would become the main way to find reviews for games or gaming news. When magazines were still the best method of getting the latest information and reveals, G4 was an untapped market. The network started in 2002 as a way to compete with Tech TV, a similar network focused on games and tech coverage. In 2005, G4 was merged with Tech TV to create possibly the most well-known iteration of the network to date. Shows like X-Play would provide video game reviews and previews for the newest releases, and shows like Attack of the Show were more focused on the broader pop culture landscape. I loved both of these shows when I was young and would run home from school every day to catch the newest episode or even a rerun I hadn't seen yet. But G4's Cheat was something I always went out of my way to watch. The show was first hosted by Corey Rouse and was later taken over by Kristen Adams. The show managed to capture that feeling that you were finding information that you shouldn't be. Cheat codes always came with the assumption that this was outside of the rules of the game, that you weren't supposed to know these codes and that they were kept secret for a reason. Watching this program, writing down these codes to use for later always felt like a ritual. I would write them down for games that I didn't even have yet, just in case I bought them or came across them later. And the appeal of the show never really made sense because it premiered in 2002 and ended in 2009. It was already out far after the time when cheat codes were available on the internet, but I still paid attention. Getting these codes from a show felt more fun, like I was engaging with something. It was special. And cheat codes overall were special. They are rarely present in major releases today. You might find them in an indie game every once in a while, a project that pays homage to the past in some way, but cheat codes have mostly disappeared. On PC, they've been rightly replaced by mods and console commands, because why do you need cheat codes when you can create your own? Throughout this video, you and I have learned a lot about strategy guides, where they came from, how they were crafted, and what they became. I tried to dive into this information in the hopes of creating a strategy guide of my own, creating something that I could add to this legacy, and also to see if writing a strategy guide is as difficult as it seems from the outside. The first step of this whole process was to pick a game to write a strategy guide for, and not any game would do because I had a list of criteria that had to be met. The game had to be short, but not too short. Since this was my first time writing a guide, I think it would probably be ill-advised for me to take on a nearly 100-hour JRPG like Persona 5. That would be just too complex for my first outing in this medium. But I also didn't want to write a guide for a game that was too short. A 1-hour walking simulator, for example, would be easy to write a guide for, but it wouldn't exactly be necessary, and I technically would have written a guide, but it wouldn't have been real. So I needed something in the middle, something short and sweet, but not so simple that it didn't warrant a guide in the first place. I also needed something with a decent amount of mechanics. Again, too many would be a recipe for disaster, and too little wouldn't have enough substance to create something necessary. I ruled out fighting games and online games because, if I'm being honest with you and myself, those were probably biting off a bit more than I could chew. RTSs and RPGs also fell into these categories as well. Before I finally landed on a game, I had a few that I was considering. The first game that came to mind when I thought short, oddly enough, was Azura's Wrath. This was probably honestly because of the big fuss that was made when this game was released, that it was too short for a $60 price tag, and for some reason that's stuck in my mind over the years. Azura's Wrath is still a fantastic action game that goes completely off the rails, but as I started playing it, I realized that the difficulty options were going to be a problem. I wasn't nearly good enough at the game, and getting good at it over a period of time seemed like too far of a mountain to climb, at least in the interest of getting good enough to accurately convey how to get S ranks on all the missions and on the highest difficulty. So I ended up scrapping that idea. I also considered Mirror's Edge, another relatively short game, but it ended up having some time trial modes that were particularly difficult. I racked my brain for a while trying to find the perfect game. At one point, I was sifting through the Steam store and my own library looking for my Goldilocks, and then I found it. 2024's Crow Country. Crow Country is a beautiful ode to classic survival horror games with a Final Fantasy VII-like graphical style that makes it incredibly unique. While it does take quite a bit of inspiration from games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill, it does enough to stand on its own as a modern survival horror game. It was one of my favorite games of 2024, and it was a perfect fit for this guide. It has a decent amount of secrets to be discovered, so there is a reason for the guide to exist. It's relatively short, only taking a few hours to complete if you know what you're doing, and it doesn't require a ton of skill because as long as you're prepared and you conserve your ammunition well, it can be a breeze at points. The game was also just begging for a strategy guide because it's an homage to that same era that strategy guides succeeded in. And when Crow Country popped into my brain, I immediately knew it was the perfect choice. So I began playing through the game again. I completed the game once on normal survival horror difficulty. I got all the secrets, all the crystal crows that unlocks an extra outfit. I achieved the S rank, unlocking all of the rank rewards, and I replayed the game on hard difficulty. And then I began to analyze my playthroughs, going back through the game and writing out a script for the guide. I had to develop a preferred path through the game that would take the player across every area and that would allow them to find all the secrets, weapons, and notes along the way. This was frankly the easy part, listing out and describing the characters, the weapons that you could get in the game, etc. But I had one final decision to make. I originally planned to upload my guide to GameFAQs. I would put a link in the description, people could click the guide and go take a look at it if they wanted. I honestly didn't expect that many people would be interested, but it would be there if you wanted to look at it. But as I began writing this video, I realized that posting it on GameFAQs would limit the aesthetic appeal of the guide, something I've greatly praised in the strategy guides of the 90s and the early 2000s. So that meant the only way to do this, and to do it right, would be to create a physical strategy guide of my own. While this was obviously the coolest option, it made things a lot more complicated. This meant that I couldn't just write a guide and take some screenshots as visual references. I needed to create a guide entirely from the ground up. I had to create background designs, I had to choose a style, I had to create maps. It was a lot more work than I bargained for. I won't bore you with the minutia of creating a guide because it is effectively pretty boring work, but I will regale you with the tale of my biggest hurdle, creating maps. Now, I am not a professional Photoshop user. In fact, I avoid the program at all cost. I dislike graphic design outside of video so much that I have someone else create the thumbnails for every video that I upload because I detest it with every fiber of my being. Maybe it's the uncertainty of it all, just how many layers and how many adjustments have to be made. At the end of the day, it's just not my thing. But that had to change for this video. At a certain point, I realized that I needed to create maps for every room in the game, or at least an overall map that detailed where every secret, crystal crow, note, and weapon was. I originally envisioned a design that reflected the materials that the floor used in every room. I tried a lot of different methods to get this look. The first one that I tried to use was a tabletop role-playing dungeon map maker. I figured this would be perfect for what I needed because it would be simple enough for me to use and make a lot of maps quickly, and it was indeed the simplest solution, but it wasn't nearly customizable enough for what I needed to do. I tried more unorthodox methods like creating maps in game engines, Game Maker, Unity, and RPG Maker, but these all led me back to the same path. If I was going to create maps like this, I was going to have to make my own assets, which would require far too much time and skills that I just didn't have. It also occurred to me that I could pay someone to make assets for me, but that felt outside of the spirit of this video. Like I wouldn't be doing the work, so I wouldn't be seeing how difficult creating a guide would be. I could have just used the maps from the game, but screenshotting a game and then zooming into the image creates incredibly pixelated results. So I finally landed on a solution. I recreated the in-game map over top of the old one and matched the colors. This took a lot of time, but not nearly as much as recreating assets from scratch. I then placed markers everywhere so that the readers would have a complete map that showed you almost everything in the game without being overcrowded. After transferring my script to the guide pages, creating the background design, lining everything up, checking back over it, creating the maps, and laying the whole thing out, I had a completed guide. So how difficult was it? If I didn't create a physical version of this guide, it would have been much easier, but it still would have been difficult. There's a lot less to think about, and just writing a guide is a whole subject by itself. Creating a physical version of that guide is even more involved. Combing over every area of the game, looking for secrets, enemies, item locations, looking back at playthrough footage over and over again, it felt a lot like making a video for this channel. I couldn't interject my opinions, my emotions while playing the game, my thoughts on the project, just objective facts. I suddenly felt the pull to remove the romanticism and create something efficient. But I suddenly had a lot of respect for the people that had created these guides years ago. Now, you have to keep in mind that a lot of these companies had dedicated illustrators and graphic designers, and it would often be teams of 5 to 10 working on one guide. I'm just one person at the end of the day that admittedly isn't very good at a lot of the things that this guide required, but I based a lot of the guide's aesthetic on the Prima Tomb Raider 2 strategy guide from 1997. This was because the guide scene hadn't fully evolved yet. The aesthetics were not complex, backgrounds for the pages repeated, the blocking on the pages was simple, and the whole thing was far less complex than the guides that would follow it. It was a product of its time, and it only felt true to the game that the guide itself looked like something that came from that era. But that guide only credits one person. Now, I could be wrong and maybe someone else worked on this guide, but it's probably much better than what I could create 20 years later with much better technology at my disposal. In short, creating a guide gave me much better perspective on the people that made these things, because at the end of the day, I had as much time as I wanted to finish this thing. And these people were working under strict deadlines with the pressure of time weighing down on them heavily. The title of this section of the video might confuse you. I've done a lot to talk up the very concept of strategy guides throughout this project. I've praised the physical era of these books, noting that they are art. I've praised the digital era of these books, and while I think it greatly lacks a lot of the aesthetic and physical value that the previous era had, it is extremely useful and allows a lot of people to finish games that they otherwise wouldn't. So what's wrong with guides? Remember the first time that you played your favorite video game. Remember what it felt like to finish that game, to find the secrets, to overcome its challenges, to make your way through its story. Maybe it's a multiplayer game, and just getting better was the thing that stuck in your mind. Maybe you really enjoyed slowly learning from your mistakes, realizing what you did wrong and how it affected the outcome of your gameplay. Maybe you were shocked at the ending of the story. Maybe you were surprised at the final boss of the game. These moments were special, and while you can generally play a game as many times as you want, you can never play a game for the first time again. I remember the first time I played Metal Gear Solid 4 like it was yesterday. I played it with my sister, and we passed the controller back and forth for hours. The story moments hit at the perfect times, and a lot of the fun was just learning how to defeat the various bosses in the game. When the solution was found, it was like a light bulb went off. In a way, strategy guides can ruin a lot of these first experiences. Sure, experiencing a long cutscene with or without the guide is effectively the same. But if you know the areas of the game that are coming, if you know the challenges of the game that you'll face, it's effectively your second or third playthrough. It's almost as if guides don't ruin your first playthrough of the game, but they actually rob you of it. You never had a first playthrough of a game because that innocence of information was gone the second you purchased a strategy guide or read a walkthrough. I think of another one of my favorite games last year, Animal Well. Animal Well is an indie platformer developed by Billy Basso and published by Video Game Donkey's Big Mode Games. It is a fantastic experience, from the level design to the punchiness of the controls, the various items that change gameplay, and just the ability to use the game's system against it to do insane things. It's such a beautiful experience, and the first time that I played it, I was genuinely shocked. Shocked that a game so simple could move me as much as it did. Part of this movement came from the ways that the items in the game are used. Various items across the game's playtime will have different uses in different situations that you didn't think of when you first picked up the item. But they suddenly click in your head and you kind of feel dumb for not realizing it in the first place. I think of that game and how important it was to my 2024. How playing that game fundamentally changed the way I looked at video games as an experience. And I think if I played that game with a guide, I would have looked at it in a wildly different way. At the end of the day, guides do change the way that you experience a game. And while at their best, they are an extension of the game itself, they are not an intended experience. I do not feel good when I use a guide for a video game. When I look up a mission to see how it ends, when I check how many chapters are left in a game, when I only try a boss for a few minutes before looking up a strategy online, because maybe I just don't have it in me that day. It feels like defeat. And that's something I'd like to do less of, but I don't think I should feel shame for it. It shouldn't be the secret that I feel like I have to hide. I'm sure you've looked up solutions, locations, secret areas, walkthroughs, tips, wikis, any piece of information on a game that you can find by playing the game yourself falls into this category. We briefly talked about this before, but most modern games are designed around the fact that you should be able to reasonably figure out the game on your own. Not that all modern games are easy, but a lot of modern games have guides designed within themselves. The guides are the subtle nudges, the information included in the game, the maps, the level design, the waypoints, everything works together to gently nudge the player in the right direction. So while guides are wrong on a fundamental level, you should never need a guide. Because if you need a guide, then the failing is on that of the game itself. And I want to stress the word need here because I know some people are going to list examples in the comments, great games that have difficult sections, but the difficulty isn't the point. A guide should never be necessary. You should never need a guide, but guides can be wrong and useful at the same time. Just because you don't need it doesn't mean it isn't nice that it's there.
I think this is the point in the video where you expect me to sell you something, where you expect me to tell you that you can go to the link in the description and get this guide for $25. But I don't want to do that. Not because of some thinly veiled bolstering of integrity, but because to me, this guide means something. The first thing was to create something that others have created, to try and put myself in their shoes and see if this task was as difficult as I thought it was. It was an attempt to develop more of an appreciation for a medium that I don't see talked about that often. Like I said before, there aren't that many people still making physical strategy guides. You have the Future Presses and the Piggybacks, but you also have the Barnes & Noble Pokemon Minecraft slop that's sold to children who don't know any better. But you'll rarely find companies making special or limited editions of these things even today. The market just isn't there. And the secondary market isn't that hot either. Most of the guides that I've shown you in this video were bought for anywhere from $10 to $40. There are rare editions that are sold for $100 or over, but outside of the Lufia 2 Player's Guide or Earthbound Strategy Guide, it just doesn't happen. And listen, I'm not complaining. I like strategy guides, so I don't have to pay that much for them, but it says something about how we view this medium. People really, as a whole, don't care that much and aren't too sad that it's gone. Because at the end of the day, the consumer wins. They don't have to pay to figure out how to get past a section in a video game that they're stuck on. They don't have to pay to use a tip line. They don't have to buy a magazine. They don't have to buy a strategy guide. And at the end of the day, I love that, which is why I put the link to the PDF pages for the guide in the description of this video. You can browse the pages and review my miserable attempt at recreating some magic. Which brings me to my second point, that this strategy guide is not very good. I tried to iron out most of the mistakes, but I'm sure some slipped by me. And it's not very aesthetically pleasing. I tried to recapture a style of people working on a guide and churning out pages before a deadline or release date. Things aren't aligned in some places. The margins are bad. The text can be off. I'm sure there's misspellings that you'll find and let me know of. The list goes on and on. But the goal here wasn't to make something perfect. It was to create a cross between the golden age of strategy guides and the modern era. To create a physical piece that could serve as an ode to the strategy guides of the 90s and the 2000s, but to not monetize it and make the same mistakes that they did. And if for some reason you really want a physical version of this guide, you can print out the pages yourself and bind it with glue, because that's all I really did. Strategy guides aren't around anymore. Not really. And as much as we've talked about IGN, GameFAQs, and video walkthroughs, those aren't really strategy guides. If we're being purists, the only things that are strategy guides are these books that you can open and access a wealth of knowledge that you wouldn't have had otherwise. These relics of a bygone era, products of their time, things that can't and shouldn't exist today. They are temporal, pages from a different reality, because even today they don't hold up. Sure, they're cool, but they have almost no utility outside of isolating yourself from the internet. They aren't even strategy guides now. They were strategy guides then, but now they're nostalgia, representations of an era far in the past. The strategy guide market was lifted up for a short period of time and then tossed away like an old toy that we didn't want to play with anymore. And that's fine, because sometimes we have to move on. It's cold out here.